Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very timely panel today on externalization through privatization, the role of non-state actors in border enforcement and asylum exclusion. My name is Tamara Tubakovic, and I'm a teaching fellow in public policy and European studies at the University of Warwick, and I'll be chairing today's expert discussion. This expert discussion is the product of a collaboration between the new Centre for the Legal Study of Borders and Migration at Queen Mary University of London, the Jean Monnet Comparative Network on Refugee Externalization Policies coordinated by the University of Melbourne, and the Migration Policy Centre at the European University Institute. This seminar comes at a particularly crucial time in global refugee and asylum policy. Politicians, policymakers, and scholars alike recognize that the movement of refugees and asylum seekers constitutes an urgent governance challenge. Yet, as many wealthy states in the global north openly support the international refugee protection system and are in principle negotiating collective agreements for responsibility sharing, they are also simultaneously hardening their borders through even more creative migration control strategies. Migration control now involves complex relationships between public and private actors. States have externalized migration control by shifting the locus of border enforcement to third countries, while also contracting out border control duties to private actors. For example, the delegation of responsibility for visa and document checks to airlines and other carriers, the secondment of immigration liaison officers to third countries to assist with clearance procedures, and the contracting of security companies to operate detention centers and assist with the deportation and removal of migrants. This delegation of authority from government to private companies and corporations raises serious implications for the role and function of the state, state accountability, and the enforcement of international law and the protection of human rights. In this expert discussion this morning, we're aiming to develop a deeper understanding of how, when, and why states privatize migration control, how we might conceptualize the role of private actors, the nature of their relationship with the state, and the degree of autonomy that they have in the enforcement of borders, often revealing the violent and coercive dynamics that underpin these practices. We're bringing together scholars working across law, politics, and ethics in order to advance a unique multidisciplinary perspective on the privatization of migration control. So I'm really delighted to introduce to you today our esteemed speakers. So firstly, we'll hear from Dr. Violeta Moreno-Lax, who is a full professor of law at Queen Mary University, specializing in international and EU law at the intersection with migration, asylum, border violence, and security. She's the founder and inaugural director of Borders, a visiting professor at the College of Europe, legal advisor and member of the Legal Action Committee of the Global Legal Action Network, and founder and coordinator of SARBMED, the Search and Rescue Observatory for the Mediterranean. Second, we'll hear from Dr. Federica Infantino, who is a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellow at the Migration Policy Centre at the European University Institute. Her project, The Diffusion of Migration Control Practice, focuses on the role of communities and practitioners in shaping migration and border control on the ground. And she's particularly interested in the diffusion of practice and the involvement of non-state actors. Third, we'll hear from Dr. Martin Lemberg Pedersen, who is an honorary associate professor at the University of Warwick and head of policy and society for Amnesty International Denmark. Since 2019, he has been affiliated with the Advancing Alternative Migration Governance Project, funded under the Horizon 2020 program. His research involves interdisciplinary analyses of Western asylum, border, and deportation practices, and military, technological, industrial relations, with recent publications focused on European and Danish externalization of border and asylum policies. And our final speaker today will be Dr. Amy Nethery, who is a senior lecturer in politics and policy at Deakin University and network partner of the Comparative Network on Refugee Externalization Policies. She researches the development and impact of asylum policies in Australia and Asia. An important theme of her work is the analysis of asylum policy according to liberal and democratic norms of policymaking. And she has a particular interest in immigration detention, so its history, diffusion, and human impact. Each speaker will have 10 minutes maximum for their presentations, and then we'll open up the virtual floor to questions. So please do post your questions in the chat function on the YouTube page. Feel free to do them as the speakers are presenting. When you do post your questions, it would be great if you could state your name and to whom you're addressing your question to. All right, so I'm really delighted now to introduce or pass the floor over to our first speaker for today, Professor Violeta Moreno-Lax.
Thank you, Tamara. I have a PowerPoint. Let me just try and share my screen. Okay, you should all be seeing it, and I'll start my chrono as well. So thank you. It's a pleasure really to be here with you today and to launch our debate. My presentation will revolve around career sanctions, which constitute one of the earliest and legally most sophisticated examples of externalization through privatization. And I'll do this in 4 steps to show how career sanctions reconfigure the relationship between states and individuals, and particularly those in need of international protection, contrasting the rules and processes that apply when state authorities undertake entry controls directly, as opposed to when these are carried out by private transport companies themselves. And I'll do this by looking at the notions of imperfect delegation and hidden coercion. So entry controls are normally undertaken by border officials whose decisions remain subject to appeal and judicial oversight in case of a misapplication of the relevant rules. So taking this Schengen border regime as an example, we'll notice that the general rule is that entry authorization requires possession of valid travel documents, including visas, proof of means and willingness to return to the country of provenance upon expiry of the visa. And if this cannot be established, then entry must be refused. The Schengen Code contains provisions that cater for the special situation of asylum seekers. So all border control procedures must be compatible with the rights of refugees, including the principle of non-refoulement. Entry is to be authorized on account of international obligations, including human rights and refugee law obligations, and rules on refusal of entry are without prejudice to the application of special provisions concerning the right to asylum. And these special provisions have been codified in the Schengen Handbook, which provides guidelines to border guards, and most importantly, the Schengen Code provides for remedies against entry refusals. However, when carrier sanctions intervene, the picture changes quite considerably. Carrier sanction schemes are not new. They were introduced for the first time in the 19th century as a mechanism of migration control, and thereafter many countries have followed suit around the world. In Europe, member states started adopting career liability regulations in the mid-80s as a direct response to rising numbers of non-European asylum seekers coming to their territories. Denmark led the way in 1983, with Germany, the UK, and Belgium following in 1987, and then France, Italy, and the Netherlands in the early 90s. Career liability schemes encompass typically fines and repatriation duties of passengers who are rejected entry. And this is also the approach adopted under the Schengen rules. The schemes epitomize, as a result, a twofold externalization of border controls: downwards through delegation, that I'm going to argue is imperfect, to non-state actors, and upwards, exporting the borders of the country concerned abroad. The end result is that they amalgamate irregular migration with refugee flows, preempting travel to both categories on the same basis, that being the lack of adequate documents, ignoring the underlying circumstances. Screening measures by carriers, they typically place in check-in points, in ports and in airports of third countries before boarding. And the inspections serve as a pre-arrival enforcement tool for entry requirements, physically impeding irregular movement. Although it has been argued that carrier sanctions are nothing more than visas and their effect is equivalent, visas alone do not impede travel. The absence of visas, when one is required, irregularizes movement, but it does not block physically access to the border. Pre-vetting systems, like the ones enforced through career liability schemes, is what actually prevents safe journeys, pushing migrants, including refugees, into the very irregularity that these schemes are supposed to counter. leaving them no alternative but to rely on smugglers and traffickers to reach safety. So if we look at the situation under the Schengen regime, we see that carrier sanctions distort entry controls. We see that carriers are to be fined when they transport undocumented migrants, which entails a requirement for them to refuse boarding on a document inspection by checking passports and checking visas. Although the system is supposed to remain subject to the obligations resulting from the Refugee Convention and is in theory without prejudice to the member states' obligations in cases where third country nationals seek asylum, in practice, neither the Schengen Convention nor the Carriers Liability Directive provide for any safeguards or remedies to ensure that the application of these provisions happens in practice, like the ones that would normally apply under the Schengen Code when government authorities intervene. So that's why I'm speaking about imperfect delegation. It is under the pain of sanctions that commercial carriers are compelled to check travel documents, are induced to reject boarding if persons lack adequate visas and passports, whatever the underlying reason. And these provisions, as a result, transform the nature of the relationship between states and individuals. There is a delegation of power, there is one indeed, onto private carriers, but this is for them to check only part of the entry requirements that are necessary for admission, not the entire gamut of the conditions required under the Schengen rules. The delegation is imperfect because legally carriers are not required to check all admission criteria, but only to check that the passengers they transport are in possession of the travel documents necessary for entry. They are under no duty to take account of possible exceptions in light of international obligations or to entertain appeals against undue rejections of embarkation. They have also no authority to adopt any special procedures for protection seekers, and the decisions are solely based on formal inspection of travel documents. So the outcome is that their intervention oversimplifies the conditions for entry, making them narrower than provided for by the Schengen regime, de facto overwriting the applicable rules. The imperfect nature of this delegation manifests itself also in the fact that the penalties that they risk are only being imposed if passengers do not possess the required documents, but not for an excess of zeal. There are no fines if carriers unduly deny boarding to a passenger. So the incentives are disproportionately on the side of restriction for carriers to make cautious decisions and reduce the margin of error. Any decisions they adopt are in addition supposed to be discretionary. They're not directly supervised or double-checked by the authorities of the destination country. So there is accordingly an encouragement for, so there isn't any encouragement for fair evaluations and no counterweight to the pressure of fines. So that at the end of the day, the process is structurally biased. Carriers exercise these delegated powers of border enforcement against individuals without the legal constraints that would normally apply to real border guards. And therefore they embody what I've called, and drawing on the work of the authors, they embody a form of hidden coercion that dissipates authority and goes unscrutinized. And coercion here is intended to capture the involuntary character of both the checks that carriers are bound to perform and the thwarting of the movement of the passengers who are denied boarding, translating a two-level chain of subordination. The coercers at one level are the member states, compelling carriers to act as inchoate immigration officers, and at a second level, the coercers are the carriers themselves, who direct passenger behavior, forcing them into a particular course of action. But coercion is not directly addressed to migrants in this scheme. It's hidden away through the intermediation of the carriers and the coercive relationship that unites them to the member states. It is not the ends of the carriers or the interests of the migrants that are being advanced through this scheme, but ultimately those of the state, who thereby maintain a form of hidden, remote control. While state coercion may be generally accepted, one would think, in political terms, in ethical terms, in moral terms, in legal terms, privatized coercion is harder to justify, as it breaks the monopoly of official power, disrupting normal responsibility and accountability conduits. Carriers, in the end, are put in an awkward position. Entry checks are legally designed, if you look at the rules, as manifestations of public power, the exercise of which is reserved to public officials under the Schengen norms. Therefore, carriers draw in this scheme, acting as pseudo-official checkers of only part of the relevant conditions for admission, has no legal coverage in these provisions, situating carriers' liability schemes in a paralegal universe outside the normal bounds of the rule of law. Thank you very much for your attention. If you're interested in knowing a bit more, I've listed some of my work in this area for further consultation, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Violetta, for that fascinating discussion on the transformation of state responsibility and the sort of incomplete contracting out of responsibility to private actors and the violence that often underpins these neoliberal practices of outsourcing. So we'll turn now to our second speaker, Dr. Federica Infantino. So the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Hi, thank you. Thanks a lot, Tamara. Thank you all. I'll start by sharing my PowerPoint. Here it is. Okay. So as Tamara was talking about in the presentation, the summary of this idea of webinar, and as Violetta's presentation also demonstrates, this is an issue we are talking about, this externalization through privatization, this double meaning of externalization towards other countries and other actors, which echoes the idea of remote control. This is a topic, a very, very important topic today, and it can be addressed by very different angles. Here I'm taking a more political science perspective, political sociology perspective, and organizational perspective. And first, I won't go in very much detail about this, but I'd like to point to how it is an interdisciplinary topic. It can be addressed from many points of view, also beyond those who study borders and migration. So this delegation of government's function is a topic typically addressed also in public administration. It talks about the transformations of the state. It refers to issues of accountability, blame avoidance. So this is really a topic that can be addressed from very different point of views. What I'm focusing on with this presentation is the role of private companies in shaping organizational responses to migration. So this is really my angle. And I focus, as Tamara said in the beginning, while nicely presenting my work, I really focus on the implementation level stage of policymaking, considering this stage as policymaking. So not just as a consequence of what's written on paper, but really as a stage that must be studied in itself. And I follow the lines also of those students of migration policy making that look at policy processes rather than policy outputs. And here I'm really taking the perspective, a very political sociology perspective about the idea of governance as a way to take account of configurations of state and non-state actors and the interactions that these actors have across venues of policymaking. So I'm also fostering an actor-centered or bottom-up approach to conceptualize processes of change in government. And here I'm really engaging with this idea of informal governance, and we will see how, because I'm looking at all those exchanges that are non-codified, non-publicly sanctioned, but that matter because they lead to public decisions. And so I'm really looking at the role of private companies in this. I'm building this analysis on qualitative research I've been conducting in the last 10 years with actors and organizations involved in the implementation of different policies in migration and border control, mainly visa policy, detention, and asylum policy. The companies I'm really focusing in this analysis are companies involved mainly in visa policy and in detention, in immigration detention. These are companies many of us know, some know, we know better, like G4S, which is a company that is specialized in security services all over the world. We encounter this company often at airports because they are responsible of security checks. And they also run detention centers like Serco, which is a British company, and also VFS Global and TLS Contact, which are the private service providers in the implementation of visa policy at the global level, and TLS Contact more at the European level. I will focus now to show on how these companies shape policy processes, policymaking processes on the ground. I will focus on three main aspects. First of all, how they start and develop the business. So the starting of the business, like the business of visa services outsourcing, really started in informal interaction with US and French embassies in India and China. We see that these companies, to develop their business, they seek for informal contacts with state actors. So we have the state actors that say how, for instance, TLS Contact make lots of presentations to their, they go in ministries and make presentations. We have also the intergovernmental consultations on asylum, refugees, and migration, in which there is a technology working group, in which one program officer says that technology providers are regularly invited to the meetings. The European Asylum Agency, although they don't have industrial roundtables on regular basis like Frontex, for instance, they are, these officers of the agency interact with private service providers and see presentations, see demos about ICTs, in particular during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what I could see with my fieldwork is that really to start and develop the business and sometimes even to create the company, the informal contacts with state actors is key. And also the fact that there are call of tenders, but these call of tenders are often won by the same company, because this is a company with whom they have contacts, and because there is a relationship based on trust with this company. So really, this is very exemplary of what Granovetter says about how economic action is embedded in structures of social relations. Obviously, all these are tabooed topics because they come into terms with the myth of market competition. Because in the end, the call of tenders are based on trust, really connected to social informal contacts between state and non-state actors. The second aspect that is interesting to underline is how private solutions find public problems, in the sense that how private companies support organizational change because if we take an organizational point of view, so we think of organizational theories that posit how organizational change is driven less by problems than by solutions, meaning that if you start with a solution, organizations face a lot of problems rather than solutions. And if you start with a solution, there is a good chance that you will find a problem that this solution can address. And organizations scans for solutions, and private companies actors look proactively, offer solutions and search for choice opportunities, which are these occasions when an organization is expected to take a decision. So, and this dynamic is, for instance, exemplarily explained by the business developer of G4S, who says that the diffusion of the business goes in the background, that it is important to have contacts with state actors, to understand where there is an opportunity, so a choice opportunity. It says you have to look for where the customer pain is, and then you have to dive in. And he used this image of saying that when he does his training, he uses this visual about how a polar bear feeding in the Arctic, and there is a salmon that jumps in his mouth. So really seeking for the opportunity to jump and present a solution. There are many other examples about how exceptional events framed as crises, like the refugees reception crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic, are choice opportunities in which these private companies immediately mobilize their contacts and start to offer solutions. And this is how they actually affect organizational change. And the third aspect I would like to point is how these private companies are actors of transnational organizational change. So because many of these companies are global players, they also have another effect. They diffuse ways of doing things. They diffuse implementation practices. And so they diffuse ideas and ways of understanding how to address issues related to migration across national context. And this is very clearly stated by the Deputy Director of Detention Operations in the Home Office in the UK, who says that they get inputs from the service providers like G4S or Serco. In particular, Serco, there were many examples about Serco. Serco's management style in Australia basically transferred to the UK. So some ideas, some practices were coming from Australia through Serco. And also the manager of immigration sector at Serco describes his relationship, his informal contacts with the Home Office staff, and how this sustain their working together, the public-private cooperation. Also, there are other examples that come from G4S, in which G4S at a certain point instructed the government, the Austrian government, on how to build an immigration removal center in Austria. And they say that they built it that way because they were going to manage it as they managed Brookhouse and Tinsley in the UK. And also there's other way. There are circulation of actors like a G4S work manager in Belgium who goes to the UK to see how they manage the asylum reception facilities in Sheffield, and to get ideas on how to to build and manage the immigration reception facilities in Belgium. So basically, there there is empirical evidence about how these practitioners come together, they exchange informally, and basically they are engaged in social processes of learning across national contexts. And so they are also responsible for diffusing ways of doing things. And providing, shaping policy making on the ground, and also shaping ideas about how to address some issues, and also how to understand problems or problems about migration. So just to conclude, I'd like to underline how basically private companies shape policy processes also on the ground, how they are actors of transnational change. And so if we take these organizational perspectives, I mean, this is, I think, the contribution we can make to this field of analysis. And also what is important to see is that these are informal practices, informal processes, meaning uncodified and not publicly sanctioned, that are a reality to investigate empirically. Obviously, they raise normative questions about transparency, about accountability, and this is very well put into, it's very well underlined by lawyers. And so this is also important, but also what is the transparency of these practices, and also what is also important, I think, to put forward is that this is informality belongs to formal institutions, formal processes, and especially processes in the global north. So really, this is a perspective that dismisses the idea that informality simply belongs to developing country, or they are characteristics of some places, but they actually can be found in the global north as well. And yes, I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Many thanks, Federica, for providing such a rich detail and unpacking of the role of these private actors in the construction of knowledge on privatization and on externalization, and in particular your focus on this sort of transnational epistemic, diffusion among private actors. So now we'll turn to our third speaker this morning, Dr. Martin Lemberg Pedersen, who will also have 10 minutes to share his insights.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Can you all see my slideshow? Yes, it's good. Let me just put 10 minutes so I don't steal any time. So thank you for inviting, first of all, for the Borders Center, and also Violetta and Tamara for taking this very timely approach. A certain deportation flight to Rwanda was halted yesterday, so this is certainly right on the point in terms of relevance. I'm going to talk further into the interdisciplinary focus, complementing the two first presentations about the actors and lobbyism in EU markets for border control. And as Tamara pointed out, I'm an honorary associate professor at the University of Warwick. I'm also the head of policy and documentation at Amnesty International Denmark, but I'm speaking in the capacity of the former, and more specifically based on my participation in the research consortium Advancing Alternative Migration Governance. It's a Horizon 2020 project from two reports that we published under that project. It's called The Political Economy of Entry Governance and Frontex and Exit Governance, and you can find it at AdmiGov's website, so I'm not going to reference that any further. The structure of my talk is going to be as follows. So first, I'm going to talk about lobbyism in EU border control policies, formal and informal networks in EU lobbying. I'm going to talk a little bit about contracts connected to externalization visions, and more specifically about EU-Turkey policies with an example from that. And then I'm going to round off talking about lifting the gaze a little bit to the financial dimension underpinning these European border control policies before a conclusion, provisional conclusion perhaps. So through the AdminGov project, what we looked into was procurement and contracts via Frontex, EU LISA, Copernicus, Horizon 2020, and Europol contracts. I'm not going to go all through all of this, but just note that this is, although very wide, only a possible snapshots of this political economy underpinning EU border control policies. And an important note is also that when we talk about externalization, as has been also illustrated by the two first presentations, this is of course something that takes place also at a bilateral level. So there is a complementarity, but also differences when it comes to looking at EU contracts. But when we look at EU contracts, they are also underpinning a lot of the bilateral policy drives. And this market for EU border control is one that is publicly subsidized, and it is also multi-sectoral. So this means that it operates across a wide range of actors, from large multinational conglomerates to small businesses, medium-sized businesses contracted for smaller aspects related to border control. In the presentation, I'll sort of move from the larger to the smaller in the case of the EU-Turkey agreement, but it's worth noting that it is multi-sectoral. The biggest contracts are consistently awarded to information communication technology companies, biometrics, aerospace, and defense companies. And the dominant framing, which has been consistent since the 2000s, is something about an urgent gap in EU competitiveness on the markets of these companies, that there's urgent gaps in security. And then the positive framing is often sometimes that it fosters EU single market and creates jobs for member states. Now, this is just some of the companies involved in these contracts have been plotted into this map, and we see that the largest ones are in Western Europe. This is not to say all of them, and there is certainly a lot of joint ventures going on as well, but these are some of the driving actors, private security companies in this policy drive. They use different kind of strategies when it comes to EU lobbyism. Some have in-house company lobbyists, some hire communication firms, consultancy firms, and law firms. Then there are also interest organizations, sort of umbrella organizations, pushing the same agendas, such as the Association of Aerospace and Defense of Europe, and also the European Organization for Security. At the European Parliament level, we have intergroups such as Sky and Space. And then there are also other parliamentary groups which are sort of difficult to grasp whether they are having an official status or not. That could be the Kangaroo Group as one example. We created a database as part of these projects, the AdminGov project, and this is just one example to illustrate for you. We used the transparency register to note how many meetings and when and about under which DGs the different companies interacted with the European Commission. This is Leonardo plotted in. I can reveal to you that others such as Airbus will have much more meetings, but this is to give you an impression of the kind of influencing that these companies exercise. And this is only at the Commission level. The other levels, such as Parliament, takes place through these other venues I just described. And at bilateral level, of course, it is less possible actually to make such kind of an overview because they don't have the same kind of transparency register rules, minister calendar access, etc. But that would be an ideal case to plot in the many meetings that take place. If we look at the Eurosur project, this is a good example to illustrate externalization processes, because the Eurosur is connected with an ambition to foster, as you can see in this quote from the Eurosur handbook from 2015, to foster third country capacities for border control. So this is the export of technology from member states and the EU to third countries. But if we then look into sort of fracturing down this kind of activity from shareholder to company to the relevant EU agency, which program we're talking about, and then contracts, this kind of graph can be constructed where we see Spanish GMV getting contracts from Frontex to build Eurosur infrastructure, and then comes these contracts that follow in the bottom. These other contracts is also Eurosur is breaking it up in a different manner. You see the chronological timelines from Civipol, who created a feasibility study, to the Vortex study. And what's worth noting is, if you look at these reports, they are externalization visions also. There are large components about how to externalize and collaborate with third countries. And there's a political economy associated with it that produces these discourses. And as Federica noted, exercise or are granted a role of expertise knowledge by European institutions. And we break it down through the GMV research and development contracts, which happens through framework projects, framework programs. And so this is to say that there is a large research component actually behind these contracts. There's a political economy of knowledge creation and production, which then manifests in the chronology furthest to the right, the actual contracts into the Eurosur. This is very briefly mindful of time, but just to note that under these, this is Framework Project 7, under these, this kind of knowledge production is then diffused out with contracts to different kind of actors from different kind of sectors in different kind of member states. So there is a very large sort of, let's call it a kind of alignment process that goes on through these, in this particular case, FP7 projects. I noted that I wanted to talk a little bit about EU-Turkey policies, and as was noted before as well, what we see is a drive where Frontex has a lot of contracts to offer. They have industry days on return. They've had this since 2015, where they invite industrial actors to bring input and expertise knowledge into how to realize these policies. And these input are then translated into a range of contracts. I can't go through all of them, but this particular graph shows contracts for EU-Turkey returns, i.e. passenger ferries. So now we're down to the more sort of local actors who gain, small and medium-sized businesses who gain contracts. Finally, the financial dimension is a way to look behind into the shareholders behind these companies who get these contracts. This case in point is EU LISA, a certain agency, but the same can be constructed for Eurosur and other contracts. It is interesting to note that private capital is very influential in the ICT contracts, for instance. So to conclude, you can look at these different kind of programs, including Eurosur, by constructing these databases, and it unravels a political economy that is crucial behind the aspect of externalization, where security and defense industry feature in multi-leveled EU entry governance through a variety of lobbyism strategies and capture of RD funds that is underpinned by this financial dynamics of shareholding, grants and loans to companies. And with that, I will say thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin. I really enjoyed sort of the parallels a bit with Federica's presentation on the production of knowledge, but obviously coming from a slightly different perspective, but nevertheless sort of emphasizing the importance of actor networks and the relational elements of knowledge production. So we'll move on to our final speaker, but before we do, I just want to encourage everyone that's joining us today to post your questions into the YouTube chat function. Just put your name and who you're addressing the question to, and we'll get to the questions just after Amy Nethery has shared her insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara and Violetta, for inviting me to speak tonight, Melbourne time, so greetings from wintry Melbourne. I also want to say how pleased I am with the organisation of this event. With me coming last, I feel like I'm doing a deep dive and able to provide an illustration very clearly, particularly of the work that Frederica and Martin have done, and I'm giving some gritty detail in my paper about what this looks like on the ground in Australia's context of Australia's offshore processing arrangements. So I want to say from the outset that Australia's two offshore processing arrangements, one with Nauru and one with Papua New Guinea, they're no longer closed sites of detention, but there are still refugees in both locations, and these regimes still continue. So even though right now we're not talking about closed sites of detention, we still the regimes still exist. And yes, I think somebody mentioned earlier that the horrifying development in the UK about mirroring this policy with the deportation of people to Rwanda is something that we're paying close attention to. So look, in my 10 minutes that I've got today, I want to speak about three aspects of privatisation in Australia's offshore detention regime. The first is the question of money. So I'm going to give us some euro figures, some dollar figures and some euro figures, which I've converted for us. The second thing that I want to talk about is the secrecy that privatisation affords with this regime. And thirdly, I want to close by reflecting on the character of detention that is enabled by privatisation. So three things. First, let's talk about the money. I want to outline just quickly who gets it, how do they get these contracts, how much money do they get, and for what services. So in Nauru and Papua New Guinea, there are two different private companies that are ultimately responsible for these two different arrangements. So I'm going to go through each in turn. Construct International was awarded the contract for operations on Nauru in 2017. So it took over from the previous operator, which was the multinational organisation Transfield, which later changed its name to Broad Spectrum and then even later Ferrovial. So this company had run these detention centres for about 5 years or so, but it had repeatedly sought release from the contract from the Australian government, largely to do with the reputational damage that being involved in the offshore processing arrangements afforded it. So it was wanting to move away. The Australian government couldn't find anybody to replace these organisations, and so Transfield Broad Spectrum was continued until it found this company, Construct. So who are they? Unlike Broad Spectrum, Ferrovial, Construct has no history of work in carceral facilities, and in fact no history of work at all with vulnerable populations. It is a Queensland-based construction and logistics company, and at the time that it was awarded the contract, it was only worth about 8 million Australian dollars. So what's that, about 5 million euro, I think. At the time that it was awarded, a 254 million euro contract for managing Nauru. So it was a very small company given this very big contract. Its two credentials seemed to be that it was involved with the construction of the original detention centre on Nauru, and that its managing director was a donor to the Liberal Party, which until 3 weeks ago was the governing party in Australia. After the government awarded Construct the contract without a competitive tender process, it was revealed that an audit of the company's finances that was commissioned by our Department of Home Affairs had actually audited a different company that had a similar name. But a second audit was not commissioned, and the contract was awarded in any case. Since 2017, Construct's contract has been extended 7 times, again without competitive tender, and is now worth over 1.6 billion Australian dollars, or over 1 billion euro, to look after 100 refugees still held on Nauru after being sent there close to 10 years ago. So doing the maths, it now costs more than 2.8 million euro to look after each person per year. CanStruck's role is an ongoing one, and it was confirmed late last year when Australia announced that its arrangement on Nauru would be an enduring regime. The company that managed the final few years of the detention centre on Papua New Guinea, Paladin, is even more mysterious. So when Paladin won the lucrative contract in 2017, the company was completely unknown. The only address listed was a beach shack on a remote Australian island and a post box in Singapore. There was no website, no public information about its board director, no previous work that anybody could find that this company was involved in. Yet, without a tender process, Paladin was awarded a $285 million contract in urgent circumstances, according to the Department of Home Affairs, to run the operation on Manus Island from 2017 to 2019. Later, an Auditor General investigation found that Paladin failed to provide value for money. It has been estimated that Paladin made a profit of €860,000 every week during its contract. So by any account, these contracts at best do not live up to the principle of fiscal responsibility, and at worst are blatantly corrupt. Second thing that I wanted to discuss is secrecy that privatisation affords. Australia's offshore processing facilities are funded wholly by Australia according to Australian policy, but they take place on the territory of other sovereign nations and are operated by private companies. Within this policy design, there are multiple layers of opacity and obscurity regarding the day-to-day operations of the facilities and what happens when something goes wrong. So one of the key issues is that the contracts are commercial in confidence. So we aren't privy to the details, but we can infer some of the character of the reporting requirements, or in fact, when those reporting requirements are completely missing. For example, an audit of Paladin's operations in Papua New Guinea found that there were no reporting requirements at all for 8 months of the 2 years that they held the contract. We can also infer that there are disincentives built into the contracts for reporting when things go wrong, which leads to behaviour where companies do not report and in fact cover up bad news. We also know that much of the abuse inflicted upon detainees within the centres comes from people contracted to work within these private companies. So in Papua New Guinea, for example, 2 guards employed by the company G4S were found to be responsible for the death of detainee Reza Barati during a riot in 2014. Later, Wilson Security was subcontracted to manage the security operations, and their guards have been accused of a range of physical and sexual abuses, including of children. A 2015 Senate committee investigation into violence and abuse in the centres heard that Wilson Security was in the practice of filing incident reports, including those regarding the abuse of children, in so-called File 13, which was their joking name for the shredder. Secrecy is also built into the contracts in another way by virtue of the Border Force Act in 2015. So this law makes it illegal for anyone who works for the Australian Border Force or any government agency or anyone contracted by the Australian government to work with non-citizens to speak publicly about their work. The penalties include prison time. So we know that secrecy in carceral institutions inevitably leads to human rights abuses. The Border Force Act is a law that makes human rights abuses inevitable. So to wrap up with my third point, which is a reflection on the centrality of private operators to the design of these policies. And this really touches on a lot of the things that my 3 previous speakers were talking about earlier. So these secretive, authoritarian and deeply harmful institutions are a particular construct of neoliberalism in which governments eschew responsibilities for human well-being and encourage corporate greed. The type of offshore processing that Australia has implemented in the last decade depends upon a profit-driven business model that is unimpeded by any principles of humanity. More than being a designed-in feature, privatisation enables Australia's offshore processing regime to exist in the form that it does, and it gives shape and character to that form. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Amy, for exposing the sort of dangerous and lucrative business of privatisation in Australia. And also just, when we look at it from a public policy perspective, exposing the sort of limitations to these practices, both, from a sort of value perspective, but also from a fiscal perspective, which I think is a really important component, and sort of raises the question of why states would also sort of seek to emulate such policies. And I guess maybe we can come back to that question during the conversation. So I'll turn now to the Q&A. We do have several questions in the chat, but I do encourage everyone who's joining us today to post your questions, and I'll get to them in a moment. So what I might do is I might group sort of two questions together and then present it to the speakers and give them an opportunity to respond. So in the chat, we have a question from Aline to Professor Moreno-Lax. The question is, have there been any legal challenges or court cases regarding carrier sanctions in the EU? Just considering their fundamental rights implications for asylum seekers that you pointed out, Violetta. And then we have a follow-up question from Emre. How do UN agencies respond to the hidden coercion mechanisms? So we'll start off with those two questions.
Right, thank you, Tamara. Thank you very much. I've typed my answers actually because I thought that was going to be easier. But I can as well speak to that quickly. So basically, in terms of Aline's question, just wanted to say that there's been a spree of litigation, particularly right after most career liability schemes were first introduced in Europe, so in the 90s. And at that point, courts actually acknowledged the impact of fines and the career liability, the working of the mechanism. And they've highlighted that the ultimate result is that they pose substantial obstacles in the path of refugees. And in the UK, there are two examples of cases that I think are particularly telling for our purposes. One is the case of Khalil Yassine, and the other one is Vilva Raja, which went further up to the Strasbourg Court, the European Court of Human Rights. And in both situations, courts appeared to acknowledge that career sanctions do entail this imperfect delegation and hidden coercion mechanisms that I've been speaking about, and that the end result is to produce illegality in the movement of refugees. But as much as they show concern, they fail to declare these schemes illegal for non-conformity with refugee law or human rights obligations. And I have quotes from those two decisions that I've put on the chat and that perhaps can be copied and pasted over so that then they can be read by participants in their own time. In relation to the question to Emre, EU agencies, I think, are quite comfortable behind the veil of the many hands, or the veil of imperfect delegation. I mean, there is a very similar imperfect delegation scheme going on between member states and agencies. And I think the situation with Frontex offers a particularly telling example. While political pressure has been piling up for many years now, with many actors denouncing many human rights violations, particularly in the agency, but in other external borders of the European Union as well, this has led to political accountability, if you want, in the form of the resignation of Leggeri as executive director of the agency. But there is no legal accountability mechanism that can undo the imperfect delegation and the consequences of hidden coercion. There isn't a remedy under EU law to directly contest the structural unsuitability of hidden coercion and its contribution to border violence. So this would be my two answers. I don't know if you want me to take also the question by Berfin, but obviously I leave it up to you.
Yeah. So what I might do is, because we've had some questions come through, there's questions for each of the speakers, so I might just raise them now to Violetta, to all of you, and then each of you can go along and respond to them. Now they're coming through right now, so apologies if I'm trying to read the document and read it to you. So to Violetta, you have the question, what are your thoughts on the role of non-state actors, for example, airline companies in the UK, Rwanda offshore processing arrangement? And then also, how do you see the political agency of refugees cancelling their flight tickets to prevent the transfer to Rwanda? Then we have two questions to Martin from Emery. So can any company apply for and receive contracts, or do they require any sort of accreditation to be the EU's partner in this? And then the second question sort of begins with a statement: border control operations differ from ECHO's humanitarian and development outsourcing. In the former, there's a direct sort of subcontracting with private companies, and in the latter, they require humanitarian development agents as implementing partners. And the question is, why is there a difference? And then a question, or several questions from Nicole to Federica. What do you see as the most important implications of this largely informal role of private companies in shaping organizational responses to migration? Is this a new process or something that has been going on for decades? Has it increased in frequencies? Do you see this as part of a larger trend in the privatization of governance? And then a question from to Amy from Berfin. Similar question about the role of non-state actors in the UK Rwanda offshore processing arrangement. Can that, a similar question be asked about Australia's offshore arrangements? So I'll give you, all perhaps 2 minutes to respond to those questions. And we'll start with Violetta.
Okay, thanks. Since I've already spoken, I'll just try to be brief. So to Berfin's question, I think, they could will try to oppose the requests by the Home Office. Carriers, right? Private companies that are undertaking, facilitating the expulsions to Rwanda on the basis of human rights obligations, and particularly the principle of non-refoulement, which is supposedly of customary law, if not jus cogens character, and also taking into consideration the prospect of legal challenges like the one that actually succeeded in stopping the flight in the end, as we saw yesterday in the 11th hour. The European Court of Human Rights decreed a Rule 39 interim measure for which the flight to Rwanda had to be landed, and it hasn't taken place. The agency of, but on the other hand, legally speaking, carriers have no obligation to do any of this. So at the end of the day, it boils down to their own, political inclinations or ethical qualms about what is happening to refugees. The obligations, the human rights obligations, are only on the Home Office and the government itself. And in terms of the agency of refugees, I think this is curtailed to the minimum expression. At least this is the attempt that the new rules are trying to achieve in the Borders and Nationality Act of 2022. But we see refugees voting with their feet, and they have advocates and political opinion on their side. So I think this is both a legal and political, if not also an ethical battle on the legitimacy of coercion that takes the form of direct coercion, that amounts to penalization for the irregular entry that some refugees are forced to undertake to come to the UK, and that goes against basic principles of the 1951 Refugee Convention. I think they have the political legitimacy and obviously the legal and ethical principles on their side. And this is going to be a battle that I think we're going to see the Home Office losing in the end. Thank you.
Okay, I'll jump in, I suppose. Yes. Okay, thank you for these wonderful questions and for this discussion, which is very, very interesting. I mean, to reply to the question of the importance of these organizational responses and the informal influence, the point is that this is a not publicly sanctioned and uncodified participation to public decisions processes. So it is, these are invisible processes of policymaking, and I think it matters to shed light on them. They matter also even if they are organizational responses, because we are talking of policymaking on the ground here. We are talking, when it comes to how organizations respond to policy issues, we are talking of how they shape policy outcomes. So how do policies in the end turn out? How they impact on policy recipients. So what is the experience of people interacting on a daily basis with the policy making on the ground? So in this sense, it matters, and it matters to shed light, because always the implementation is considered as a black box. And when it comes to the informal influences of private companies, there are issues of transparency, of understanding what are the how public decisions are made, even at that level, not just when we design policies. Of course, the involvement of non-state actors is not new. What I think is relevant nowadays is the new public management framing that goes well beyond migration and border control. So here we are really engaging with the transformations of the state in the domain of migration and border control. It is particularly puzzling because migration and border control is emblematic of state sovereignty. So it is legitimate to ask, how come states privatize functions that are so emblematic of state sovereignty? What is also relevant, I think, in the field of migration is the crisis mode of migration governance. And so the fact that the fact of framing the migration phenomenon often as a crisis gives an opportunity to expand the actors involved, and gives an opportunity to private actors to jump into these moments in which decisions must be made, because these moments are framed as crisis, emergency, and things like that. And it's also extremely relevant, I think, because when we look at the implementations with private actors, and I mean, I've done research on this, it's published here and there, but we really see how the recourse to private companies is a way to circumvent public legal constraints in several ways. Because there is a distance with policy recipients, and this also, I mean, the work of the legal point of view is very relevant on this, and I think this is how it matters, and how the state also, by using private actors, regain sovereignty, in the sense that it is more capable of governing because it achieves some policy goals that go well beyond the cost-benefit calculation on which privatizations are often justified. And I'll stop here.
Great. Martin, would you like to jump in?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tamara. Well, to the extent that I can, to Emily's questions and comment, probably I can only really answer the first one, and then only partly, because can any company apply for and receive contracts? Well, that depends what level of the process we are looking at. So if we are looking at company involvement in things like Horizon 2020 consortiums, of which many European arms companies are involved, then there's a screening process that they have to fill out, and it's not insignificant. but this is in order to receive research and development funds. The trajectory of that is, of course, that if the project is, by the company standard, deemed successful in that it amounts to certain technologies, they can then apply for patents on that, and then they can use that patent to gain contract from a state, in which it's a different process than the affiliation to a Horizon 2020 project. If we look at Frontex, then, the kind of companies, small and medium-sized businesses I was detailing, giving brief examples of, well, they are indeed very small. And I'm sort of reminded a little of Amy's, the actors involved in the Australian case, because these are small tourist companies, usually only doing tourist ferries or bus transfers. And it is a mess to look at that landscape. And related to that, the OLAF, which is the EU's anti-fraud agency, actually did raid the executive director of Frontex, Fabrice Leggeri's, and his head of office, raided those offices on account of, among other things, financial irregularities with contracts back in the fall of 2020. So it is to say that probably this is a case of people, or institutions in certain aspects throwing themselves out and then afterwards dealing with the consequences of it. And when it comes to these kinds of contracts, then the screening seems at best to be quite lackluster and can be reversed. And also there's a big change in the companies involved in these contracts. Some diffuse, contracts are handed over to others. The amount of contract, the size of them also changes. And then the final question or answer to that is, of course, as I mentioned, the infrastructures which may be created through this kind of EU practices can then be transferred at a bilateral level, in which case you have all sorts of companies from third countries which cannot fulfill the same kind of screening processes. But that's kind of the legal delegation or diffusion that Federica and Violetta also, and Amy, illustrate, that's a strategy. It's part of a strategy in that these other countries, through these loopholes of externalization, the idea is that EU institutions do not occur the same kind of responsibility because it's someone else, somewhere else, under different legislative rules, different national legislations that the EU institutions and countries would seek to hold responsible, not themselves. So that's part of the raison d'etre of externalization.
Great, thank you. Amy, would you like to jump in?
Well, just to Birfin's question about the non-state actors involved in the UK-Rwanda arrangement, I actually don't have any information to speak authoritatively about that. So I would defer to my colleagues here. I think Violetta has already answered that question somewhat.
Fantastic. So we are over time, but some of the speakers have kindly agreed to stay on to answer the final two questions that have been posed. So we have a question or a few questions that I'm going to group from Claire, who has congratulated you on a wonderful webinar. So her question to all of the speakers is, to what extent have those researching in the EU context examined the profiteering that private corporations make? In the examples given by Amy regarding offshore processing, there was a scandalous case involving systemic corruption, so receiving from government $50 per hour for local employees, but only paying workers $8 per hour. And sort of, given this level of profiteering, what level of accountability exists for such potential abuses in the EU or the European context? And sort of related to that point, in Australia, there's often very little accountability and contractual correspondence, but points to a very sort of close relationship between governments and private corporations that Amy also outlined. And she would be interested to hearing from the speakers about what also appears to be sort of a symbiotic relationship between states engaged in externalization and the private bodies that they enter into contracts with. And then, so those two questions are to everyone. And then the final question I'm going to pose is to Dr. Moreno-Lax from Andres are there legal recourses available or in construction for private companies to avoid being co-opted into being immigration enforcement actors? Or do carriers only take this situation as an acceptable status quo? All right, so I'll open it up. I don't know if anyone wants to sort of jump in first on that question. Yeah, Violetta, go ahead if you want to.
I can try. I mean, I'll try to address part of Claire's question. I mean, the part on how carrier sanctions actually shape the conduct of those who work at the border, and if what to do about that. And I think Claire is spot on. I mean, carrier sanctions indeed shape the conduct of border authorities. I mean, there is an assumption that private carriers are going to play their part, and that they're going to be rejecting people without proper documentation, and that the people rejected boarding are to be deemed as irregular migrants rather than asylum seekers or prospective refugees, right? So when it comes to put together the statistics, people who have been rejected boarding come to be counted under the irregular migration statistics rather than the refugee or asylum seeker statistics, right? So there is a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in the way in which the border is now being administered. The carriers are one of the building blocks of how the border is being controlled from abroad, and their actions are officially sanctioned and accounted for as part of the official statistics, right? And then turning to Andres' question on whether there are legal resources or legal recourses available for private companies to avoid being co-opted into becoming immigration enforcement actors, and whether they actually do something to try and resist the situation, the answer is that they did try. I mean, when these schemes were under negotiation, for instance, in the European Union, the Carriers Liability Directive was adopted in 2001. And so negotiations began in the late part of the 90s, and there was a really violent back and forth between the Council and the member states on the one hand, and the European Parliament on the other, which was trying to resist as much as possible this imperfect delegation and hidden coercion mechanisms. But the end, we know of the story, right? I mean, carrier sanctions have been adopted, and they have been legitimized, and not just at domestic and European level, but they have been elevated to the international law level as well. So the ICAO Convention, so the International Civil Aviation Organization Convention, and the Facilitation of Maritime Traffic Convention are both permissive of these schemes, and they now have been accepted as part of the normal status quo of international travel by sea or by air. So the approach now taken by carriers is to simply refuse boarding to anybody who is not holding the relevant documents, and to collaborate with so-called immigration liaison officers or airport liaison officers, which are delegates, are actually state officials, which are delegated from the countries of destination at embarkation, which supposedly advise carriers on what to do and how to behave when confronted with tricky scenarios, and this as a means to avoid fines. The issue is that this is presented as voluntary action that carriers undertake to avoid fines. But I mean, obviously, they adopt this course of action under the pressure of the carrier's liability scheme, right? If the fines didn't exist, carriers would probably behave in a very different manner. So I think in the end, states have been successful in passing on the responsibility and imperfectly delegate pre-border controls onto private companies with very little legal consequences. Thanks.
Thanks very much for your letter. Federica, would you like to share any sort of final thoughts?
Yes, just to follow up on what Violetta was saying about the carrier sanction, I think the question here is how do states co-opt private actors? And we need to make distinctions. Like in the case of carrier sanctions, there are sanctions that for carriers. In the case of visa processing, that's a business that it's no cost for the government because the visa applicants pay for the fee. So the co-optation is really no cost for government. In the case of privatization of detention, for instance, the government is contracting the private companies. So here we see very different ways of co-opting. And I only wanted to provide some quick reply to Claire about the accountability, and I'll take really my practice perspective. If we think accountability from the point of view of a day-to-day practice perspective, we see that when there are intermediaries, there are private companies, these people working for private companies, they are accountable to many masters. To whom they are accountable? The company, the state they work with, the client, which is actually the migrants, and also again, if we take the practice perspective, is there a symbiotic relations between state and private actors? They work together. So on a day-to-day basis, they cooperate in the sense that they work together. This is very clear, for instance, in the visa processing, also in the detention, in the UK detention centers, the Home Office and private actors are in the same location, and they have to cooperate on a daily basis. And also another topic we didn't talk about, but I think it's also very relevant, is the issue of revolving doors. So how people working in the private sector that then go to the public sector or vice versa actually blur the distinction on the ground between private and public sector. And there are many consequences of this as well.
Yeah, really fantastic. Thanks very much, Federica. We'll turn now to Amy for any sort of final concluding thoughts on the questions. No thoughts? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. We'll close the session for today. So first, I'd like to just thank the speakers for being with us today to share their insights on this really sort of important and timely topic of privatization and advancing our knowledge of knowledge production on this. I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us today and for the questions and the discussions that have been raised around this topic. And finally, of course, I'd like to thank everyone that was sort of involved in the organization of this event, and of course, the Migration Policy Center for hosting this seminar live today on their channel. So thank you.